She tried to shame a black student for the way she read out loud, but what happened next forced a whole school and its community to finally confront what had been ignored for too long. Nobody in room 214 had any idea what was coming that morning. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, the heat blowing too strong from the old vent in the corner. 7th grade English was halfway through first period, and most of the students were more focused on trying to stay awake than anything else. Zanaya Brooks sat in the 3rd row, her long braids pulled back into a low ponytail, her hands folded neatly on her copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. She was the kind of student who teachers usually loved, quiet, respectful, always prepared. But with Ms. Van Holt, none of that seemed to matter. "Let's pick up where we left off yesterday," the teacher said, flipping through her own battered copy of the book. "Zanaya, why don't you read the next paragraph?" Zanaya's voice was soft but clear. She read slowly, pacing each word like it mattered, which it did. To her, she actually liked this book, even if she didn't like how Ms. Van Holt always seemed annoyed when she spoke. But before she could even finish the sentence, Ms. Van Holt cut in. "Zanaya," she said, loud enough for the room to shift. "This isn't one of those street corner rap battles. Try sounding like someone who's actually educated." The words hit with a strange thud. Not loud, just sharp, final. Like something had been thrown, not spoken. A few kids blinked. One boy in the back let out a low, "Damn," under his breath. Another shifted awkwardly in his chair, pretending to rummage in his backpack. The room got tight. Real tight. Zanaya froze. Her lips parted, then closed. Her eyes stayed on the page, but the letters blurred. She didn't say a word, just stared down like maybe the book could swallow her whole. Ms. Van Holt stood at the front, arms crossed, looking over her glasses like she'd just corrected something minor. Like Zania had mispronounced a word, not been reduced to a stereotype in front of 30 classmates. The silence stretched on, too long. Not one kid laughed. Not because they didn't want to, because they didn't know how. It wasn't funny. It didn't even feel like a joke. It felt like something else, something heavier. Zanaya slowly lowered her book. A classmate, Jovi Gant, glanced over at her, then at the teacher, then back again. She didn't say anything either, but her eyes said that wasn't right. Ms. Van Holt didn't move. She stood like she was daring someone to challenge her. She'd taught at Pinebrook for years, longer than any of them had even been alive, and she had that way of looking at you like you were the problem if you didn't see things her way. But she wasn't expecting what happened next. From the back corner, where the sun slanted through a crooked window pane, a chair scraped across the linoleum, slow, intentionally loud. Omari Penn stood up. He was tall for his age, lanky, always wearing the same scuffed-up sneakers and oversized hoodie. He didn't talk much, never caused trouble, always had a sketchbook in his lap, even when he wasn't supposed to. Everyone turned. He didn't raise his hand, didn't ask for permission. He just looked directly at Ms. Van Holt and said, "You don't talk to anyone like that." Silence. "She reads better than most kids in this school," he added. "And you know it. You said that because she's black." Nobody moved. Ms. Van Holt stared at him, blinking. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. Zanaya didn't look up, but you could see her shoulders, how they shook just a little, how her fingers tightened on the edge of her desk. Someone near the front let out a low whistle. It wasn't disrespectful. It was disbelief. Like they were watching something they never thought they'd see in a classroom. Omari didn't flinch, didn't sit back down. He just stood there, calm but not quiet, his hands at his sides, his voice steady like he'd been waiting for a reason to speak. For a moment, the power in that room shifted. But even when the air returned to normal, something invisible had already cracked wide open. Ms. Van Holt adjusted her glasses like she hadn't heard Omari clearly. She looked around the room, her lips tight, her jaw stiff. She didn't like being challenged, especially not by a student, especially not by a black boy she'd never paid much attention to. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice low and clipped. Omari didn't repeat himself. He didn't have to. The room had hurt him. The air still carried it. That sentence wasn't going anywhere. I said, he began again, calmly this time, that what you said to Xenia was racist and disrespectful. You knew what you were doing. He wasn't yelling. That made it worse. His tone was too calm for the chaos he was creating. He sounded more like a teacher than the teacher standing at the front. Ms. Van Holt narrowed her eyes. I'll see you after class, she said dismissively. But it didn't land the way she wanted it to. It didn't sound like control. It sounded like a thread starting to fray. Jovi spoke up next. She didn't stand, just said, "He's right," under her breath, loud enough for a few to hear. And then another voice followed. Davian Ruckley, quiet, always late, usually halfway asleep, mumbled, "That was wild, Ms. Van Holt. This wasn't mutiny. It wasn't a rebellion. But it was enough to rattle her." "All right, that's enough," she said, trying to sound authoritative again. She grabbed the marker and started writing on the whiteboard. But her hand was trembling. No one was looking at the board. Everyone was looking at Omari. Still standing. Still silent. Xenia finally raised her head. Her face was blank. But her eyes, those said everything. Confusion. Embarrassment. Maybe something else, too. Gratitude. Or maybe guilt for being the reason Omari had to do what none of them could. He glanced at her. Just once. That was all. Then he sat back down. Just like that. As if the moment didn't belong to him. As if he hadn't just ripped open something no one else had the courage to touch. The rest of the period crawled by. No one read again. Ms. Van Holt gave out a worksheet she hadn't planned for. Busy work. Something to kill time. Her voice stayed level. But she didn't make eye contact with anyone. She kept smoothing her skirt every few minutes, like the fabric could fix what had been broken. Xenia didn't do the worksheet. She sat still the entire time, her pencil in her hand but unmoving. She didn't cry. But she didn't blink much either. She was just there. Like someone stuck between two doors and not sure which one to walk through. The bell rang at 9:50. The sound felt sharp. Kids filed out quickly, whispering, glancing over their shoulders. Some patted Omari on the shoulder as they passed, quick and quiet, like they didn't want to be seen doing it, but couldn't leave without doing something. Jovi waited at the door for Xenia, then walked beside her in silence. Ms. Van Holt called Omari's name, her voice thin. He stopped. "I'll need to speak with your parents," she said, not looking at him. "You should probably speak with hers first," he replied. He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out, his sketchbook tucked under his arm, the hallway swallowing him into the stream of students. Down in the cafeteria, kids were already whispering. In the gym, it was being talked about, on phones, through texts. During passing period, it moved fast. And it wasn't just about what had been said. It was about what someone finally had the nerve to say back. But by lunchtime, it wasn't just the students who were talking. Some of the teachers had started to pay attention too. By the time the lunch bell rang, Pinebrook Junior High felt different. Not louder, not chaotic, just different. Like everybody was pretending everything was normal while secretly checking over their shoulders to see who else knew. In the teacher's lounge, the microwave beeped. Someone's leftover spaghetti was spinning behind the fogged-up glass. Ms. Lantry, who taught 8th grade math, stirred her coffee without drinking it. She had already heard. "Heard about what happened with Deidre's class this morning?" she asked, too casually, to Mr. Whitaker, the PE teacher, who was digging through his salad like it had done something to him. "Yeah," he grunted. "Kid called her out." Bold move. She really said that about street corners and rap battles? "That's what I heard." Neither one of them laughed. Meanwhile, down by the lockers outside the science wing, students clumped into tight circles, talking behind backpacks and open locker doors. "You think he's going to get suspended?" one boy asked. "For what?" a girl said. "He didn't cuss her out. He just told the truth." But teachers don't like being embarrassed. Omari sat at the end of one of the long cafeteria tables, eating from a bag of chips like nothing was different. But his phone kept buzzing. Snap notifications. Group chats blowing up. He ignored all of them. Jovi slid into the seat across from him and put down a peanut butter sandwich. "You okay?" she asked, biting her lip a little. He shrugged. "I'm fine. People are talking, I figured." "She's mad. You know that, right?" "I know." Omari took another chip, crunching slowly. Zanaya hadn't shown up to lunch. Her best friend said she'd gone to the nurse's office. Said she felt sick, but everyone knew what it really was. In the guidance office, Ms. Rowena Glasper sat with Zanaya on the couch by the window, tissues balled in her hand. She hadn't cried much. Just a few tears, but enough to make her not want to be seen. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered, like she was trying to remind herself. "No, you didn't," Ms. Glasper replied softly. "And I'm proud of you for coming in here to talk. She embarrassed me, in front of everybody." "I know she did, and it wasn't okay." Zanaya blinked fast, then looked at the floor. I don't want people looking at me like I'm the problem." "They won't," Ms. Glasper said. But even she didn't sound sure. Down the hall, Mr. Lamont, the assistant principal, was on the phone in his office. His door was closed, but anyone walking by could hear the tone in his voice. Tight, controlled, carefully worded. The kind of voice adults use when they're trying not to let something explode too fast. By seventh period, the story had changed a dozen times. Some said Omari cursed her out. Others said he threw a desk. One version had him flipping her book onto the floor. But the kids who were in the room knew. They'd heard what he actually said. And for the first time, the hallways didn't feel like a place where you just forgot what happened in class. This wasn't one of those days. Even the janitor, Mr. Bernal, who usually kept to himself and swept the halls like a ghost, paused by Omari's locker during last period. "You did something right today," he said simply. "That matters." Omari didn't answer, just gave the tiniest nod, then closed his locker. In the teacher's lounge again, Ms. Van Holt was sitting by the window, her lunch untouched. Her jaw moved like she was chewing, but her plate was still full. She was staring out at the field behind the school. You could see her blinking hard, not crying, just bracing. Mrs. Coulson, the librarian, entered and sat down 2 seats away. "You know you crossed a line this morning," she said. No venom, just honesty. "I was correcting her," Ms. Van Holt replied flatly. "No, you were exposing something you've never dealt with." Ms. Van Holt didn't answer, just stared at her untouched food. But by the time the final bell rang, the question wasn't whether the school knew, it was what they were going to do about it. By 3:20 p.m., the parking lot at Pinebrook Junior High was busier than usual. Not loud, just thick with presence. A few parents lingered outside their cars, talking low. The kind of talking that sticks to the air even when the words aren't meant for everyone. Inside the main office, Mrs. Reams at the front desk had already printed out 2 sets of incident forms. She didn't need to be told. She knew this one wasn't going away quietly. Zanaya's mother, Tanya Brooks, arrived first. She came straight from work, still in her blue scrubs, badge clipped to her shirt, hair tied back in a bun that had clearly survived a long shift. She walked through the office with purpose. Not rushing, not causing a scene, but there was something in her stride that said, "Do not play with me today." "Where's the principal?" she asked without sitting down. "He's in with the assistant principal," Mrs. Reams replied gently, rising from her desk. "Let me check." Tanya didn't nod. She didn't smile. She just waited. Moments later, the door opened, and Principal Derek Voss stepped out. He looked tired, his glasses pushed too far up his nose, tie loosened like he'd been pulling at it all day. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, extending a hand. "Come on in." Inside the office, she didn't sit until she was told. Even then, she sat on the edge of the chair like it offended her to be comfortable right now. "I need to know exactly what was said to my daughter," she began. Principal Voss folded his hands. "We're still getting the full context. The context is that a teacher humiliated her in front of an entire classroom. You've had her in your school for 2 years. Has she ever been disrespectful? Ever caused a problem?" "No, ma'am." "Then why wasn't she protected?" Voss hesitated, then said, "You're right to be upset." "No, I'm not upset," Tanya corrected him. I'm furious, because my daughter came home and didn't want to speak, and when she finally did, she asked me if she sounded ghetto. She let that word sit. It made Voss flinch. Across town, Jabril Penn, Omari's father, got the call around 4:10. He worked the early shift at the post office and was still wearing his uniform when he walked into the office, his 6'2" frame filling the entryway. Omari sat quietly in a chair, sketchbook in his lap. He wasn't drawing, just holding it like something to anchor him. Mr. Voss gave the same tight greeting. Mr. Penn, thanks for coming. Jabril looked at his son first. You okay? Omari nodded slowly. Tell me what happened. Your version, he said, ignoring the principal. Omari repeated it all. The reading, the remark, what he said, how no one else moved. Jabril listened, arms crossed. When his son finished, he nodded once. You proud of what you did? He asked him. Omari looked up. I don't know. Well, I am. Then he turned to Voss. Let me be clear. My son won't be apologizing for calling out disrespect. If this were reversed, y'all would have already sent letters home. I understand, Voss replied. And for what it's worth, I agree. Then what are you doing about it? That question hung heavier than all the others. Across the school building, Ms. Van Holt sat in her classroom, alone. Her phone buzzed with texts from fellow teachers, most of which she didn't open. A few had offered her support. Others said nothing at all. She replayed the moment in her head again. Zania's voice. Her own words. Omari standing up. She hadn't meant it that way. That was what she kept telling herself. But no matter how many times she tried to shape the memory differently, it kept playing back the same. But while she was replaying it, the district office had already received 2 parent complaints and an email from the local paper asking for comment. The following morning, the air around Pinebrook Junior High felt like it was waiting for something to snap. No announcements were made, but the students felt it. So did the staff. Eyes darted, voices dropped. It was the kind of morning where people stopped each other in the halls, not to say hello, but to check what they'd heard. By second period, Omari was called to the principal's office. Not over the intercom. A student aide came to get him, holding a small white slip like it carried a secret. He stood slowly, tucked his sketchbook under his arm, and walked down the hallway like he already knew what was coming. Zania was already there. She sat in a chair outside Principal Voss's office. Back straight, legs crossed at the ankle. Her eyes didn't lift when Omari arrived, but her hand twitched slightly in her lap, like maybe she wanted to wave but wasn't sure if she should. Come on in, Mr. Voss said. Inside the office, the walls were too white, the clock too loud. Ms. Van Holt sat on one side of the desk, her arms folded, a legal pad in her lap that she hadn't written anything on. Across from her sat Omari and Zania. Jabril Penn and Tanya Brooks sat beside their children, quiet, but very much present. We're here to talk this through, Voss began, hands clasped in front of him like he'd practiced the gesture in the mirror. Our goal is to make sure everyone is heard and treated with respect. Tanya didn't blink. Respect would have meant this meeting happened yesterday. But go ahead. Voss cleared his throat. Ms. Van Holt, I think we should begin with your account of what happened. Van Holt shifted. She looked smaller than usual, less sharp, less sure. I asked Zania to read from the book. I felt her tone lacked clarity. I made a poor comment. I was trying to redirect. Tanya cut in. You compared her to a rap battle. I did, Van Holt admitted, stiffly. And I regret that. That's not an apology, Jabril said, his voice low and steady. Omari finally spoke. You didn't correct her reading. You mocked her. And you said it loud enough so everyone would laugh if they wanted to. Van Holt winced. That wasn't my intent. But that was the result, Zania said, finally lifting her voice. You made me feel like I didn't belong here. For a second, it got very quiet. Too quiet. The clock on the wall ticked on like it didn't care. Principal Voss interjected. Ms. Van Holt, This isn't the first time we've had reports about concerns over your language in class. I've reviewed 2 prior student complaints. I wasn't aware of those being formal, she said, the panic starting to edge into her tone. They were documented, Voss replied, but this is the first time it's gotten this serious, and it's clear we can't just sweep this under the rug. Am I being fired? She asked. That's not up to me, he said, but you will be placed on administrative leave pending district review. The room didn't erupt. There was no shouting, no joy. Just a slow breath from Tanya. A slight tilt of Jabril's head. Omari leaned back in his chair and looked straight at Van Holt. Not smug, not angry. Just certain. Zania exhaled quietly. Her hands finally relaxed in her lap. Ms. Van Holt stood, nodding once, then turned and left the office. The door clicked shut behind her. Principal Voss turned back to the others. I'm sorry this happened. I really am. And I'm working with the district to ensure this is handled properly. If either of your children would like support, academic or personal, we will provide it. Tanya looked at her daughter. Zania, you want to go back to class? She shook her head. Not today. Jabril looked at Omari. You? Omari stared at the wall for a second. Yeah, I'll go. The room slowly emptied. The weight of the conversation lingered, but something had shifted. Like the pressure had been released, just a little. But down the hallway, students had already heard that Ms. Van Holt was gone, and now they had questions no teacher could avoid anymore. By the time 4th period rolled around, everyone knew Ms. Van Holt had been sent home. The news passed from class to class, whispered between locker doors, and scrawled across phone screens. Nobody knew if she'd be back. Some thought she was fired. Others said suspended. A few joked she probably wouldn't remember any of their names if she did return. But not everyone was laughing. In room 113, where Mr. Delvecchio taught social studies, the lesson on Reconstruction trailed off halfway through. He looked up from his PowerPoint and saw 20 distracted faces. He clicked the projector off. All right, he said, let's talk about what's on your minds. A few heads popped up, surprised. Then Davian, never one to speak first, raised his hand. You heard what happened with Miss Van Holt, right? Mr. Delvecchio nodded slowly. I heard. She got sent home? That's what I was told. Do you think what she said was racist? A girl named Aubrey asked from the back. He paused. I think it was harmful, he said carefully. And whether she meant it or not, that's how it landed. When you're in a position of power, how people hear you matters more than what you meant to say. That settled the room a bit. But in the teacher's lounge, there was less agreement. Mrs. Krantz, who'd taught at Pinebrook nearly as long as Van Holt, stirred her tea with more force than necessary. Deidre didn't mean it like that, she said. She was trying to make a point. Kids today are just too sensitive. Mr. Lamont, the assistant principal, set his mug down. No, this isn't about sensitivity. It's about being spoken to like you're beneath someone. That's not teaching. She was just old school. Strict. That's all. No, Beverly, he said, looking her dead in the eye. She was careless. And this isn't the first time. That stopped the room cold. Ms. Glasper, the school counselor, had heard the stories before. A few months back, a student named Kennedy had come into her office, upset after being told she shouldn't aim too high for college admissions, maybe look into technical schools instead. Ms. Van Holt's name had come up then, too, but Kennedy hadn't wanted to make a big deal of it. Her mother was working 2 jobs. She didn't have time to come to school to argue with anyone, so it went undocumented. There was also the issue with Caleb 2 years prior, when he'd used the word ain't during a group discussion and was asked by Van Holt, "Is that how they speak at home?" He didn't report it either. He just transferred to another class the following semester. Those were the things people whispered about. The stories that never made it to the office. One here, another there. Never enough to call a pattern. Until now. In the library, Mrs. Colson started pulling old yearbooks from the back shelf. She'd been at Pinebrook for nearly 20 years. She'd seen the subtle ways some students got praised more than others. How some kids were bright, while others were well-behaved. The difference always depended on whose kid it was and how they spoke. Meanwhile, in the front office, Principal Voss stared at a printed email from the district office. The subject line was bland. Pending inquiry. Classroom incident. But he knew this wasn't going to stay small. Not now. The real question, he thought, wasn't about Ms. Van Holt anymore. It was about how many kids had swallowed that kind of treatment and said nothing. How many had gone home feeling smaller, thinking maybe it's just me. That was the part nobody wanted to talk about. And in the hallway near the science labs, Zania stood at her locker with her friend Jovi. "Do you think she'll come back?" Zania asked. Jovi shrugged. "Does it matter?" "It does to me. She made you feel like you weren't smart." Zania looked down. "I know, but I still want to understand why she did it." Jovi paused. "Maybe it's not about understanding her. Maybe it's about making sure nobody else goes through that." Zania nodded slowly. But what neither of them knew was that a school board meeting had just been scheduled for that Friday, and what happened next would reach far beyond just Pinebrook. Friday night came colder than usual for mid-March in Terre Haute, Indiana. The lot outside the Vigo County School District offices was full well before 6 p.m., headlights cutting through the dusk as parents, teachers, and students filled the small auditorium where the monthly school board meeting was about to take place. It wasn't just regular attendees anymore. Not tonight. Tonight, the back rows were lined with teenagers, hoodies pulled up, sneakers tapping lightly against the tile floor. There were parents standing along the sides, holding tote bags and coffees, scanning the agenda like it held a courtroom verdict. And at the very front, flanked by her attorney and union rep, sat Ms. Deidre Van Holt. Hair pulled tight, shoulders stiff. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't have to. Her silence was its own kind of statement. Principal Voss sat 2 rows behind her, alone. Jabril Penn arrived with Omari. He wore the same brown coat he'd worn to work that morning, face calm but unreadable. Omari walked beside him, hands in his pockets, eyes sweeping the crowd as if he didn't believe this was all happening. Tanya Brooks came in 10 minutes later with Zanaya. Her daughter walked in step with her, a little slower than usual, but her chin was up. She hadn't said much all day, but something about being in that room made her straighten her spine. At 6:15 sharp, the board chair, Leon Grambly, banged his gavel lightly. "Let's bring this meeting to order." For the first 15 minutes, they stuck to the agenda. Field trip budgets, textbook approvals, facility repairs. Nobody listened. People scrolled on their phones. Others whispered to each other. Everyone was waiting for one thing. Finally, the item appeared. Personnel review. Pinebrook Junior High incident. Grapevines and phone trees had done their job. Everyone in that room knew what that meant. Mr. Grambly cleared his throat. "We've received multiple complaints regarding remarks made by Ms. Van Holt, a teacher at Pinebrook. At this time, we will open the floor to public comment." The line formed fast. First up was a woman named Shelley Byers, a former PTA president. "I've known Deidre for 15 years, she said. "She's been tough, yes, but I don't believe she's racist. We shouldn't destroy a career over one mistake." Some murmurs of agreement rippled through the older audience members. Then a parent named Corinne Willis, black, single mother of 2, stepped forward. "My son was in her class last year. He came home one day asking if it was okay that he didn't sound white enough. I didn't push it then. I wish I had." Silence. A teacher, Mr. Del Vecchio, came up next. "I've worked with her. I've defended her before. But when a pattern emerges, we owe it to our kids to listen. We're educators, not gatekeepers of who deserves dignity." Omari's name came up again and again. Some called him brave. Others said he'd overstepped. A few people danced around words they didn't want to say directly, words like tone, respect, manners. Then Jabril stood. He didn't speak like a politician. He didn't pace or wave his arms. He just said this. My son didn't raise his voice. He didn't lie. He stood up for someone who was humiliated. If that's not what we want our kids to learn to do, then what are we even doing here? He stepped down without waiting for a reaction. Tanya didn't go up to the mic. She didn't need to. Zanaya did. She walked up slowly. Her voice was low, but the mic caught it. I don't want Miss Van Holt fired because I hate her. I just want to stop feeling like I have to shrink myself to make other people comfortable, that's all. Someone near the back clapped, just once. then another. It spread, not loud, not forced, just enough. The board didn't vote that night. They said they'd deliberate, that the district had to review all information, but everyone knew the decision had already started writing itself in real time. But as the crowd filtered out into the cold night, it wasn't the board's decision that felt most important. It was the fact that, for once, the students had been heard. Monday morning felt different. Not louder, not busier, just aware. When the first bell rang at Pinebrook Junior High, students filed into class without the usual rush or groaning. Hallway chatter stayed low. Teachers looked up more often than usual. It wasn't fear, it was alertness. As if everyone had just been reminded how fragile trust could be inside these walls. Zanaya walked into English class. Same seat, third row. But there was a substitute at the front, Mr. Nielsen, a retired teacher from another middle school across town. He greeted everyone with a warm, tired smile and said they'd be reading short stories for the next few days. No one asked where Ms. Van Holt was. They already knew. Zanaya opened her notebook but didn't write. Instead, she glanced around the room, at Jovi, scribbling in the margins of her folder, at Davian with his hoodie up and headphones half hidden under his collar, then at the back corner. Omari wasn't there. She felt something tighten in her chest before she saw him, walking past the window, a late slip in hand. He entered quietly, handed it to the sub, and sat down without looking at anyone. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Near the end of class, Zanaya raised her hand. Mr. Nielsen smiled. "Yes? I'd like to read something," she said. He paused. "Of course." She stood up, not with drama or flair, just quiet intent. Then she opened her notebook and began reading a poem she'd written over the weekend. Her voice was stronger than anyone expected. It wasn't about Ms. Van Holt. Not directly. It was about voices. The ones people try to shrink. The ones that are told they're too much, or too loud, or not the right kind of smart. It was about learning to breathe again after someone's words try to steal the air from your chest. Halfway through, Jovi looked up. By the last line, Omari had lifted his head too. When Zania sat down, no one clapped. That wasn't the point. The silence after was the kind that meant people were thinking, actually thinking. Later that day, Principal Voss visited their classroom, just for a few minutes. He thanked them all for how they handled the last week. Then he handed out a flyer. Student Forum. What respect looks like in school. Open discussion next Thursday. Led by students. Open to faculty. He said it was optional. But something about the way he said it told them it wasn't just another school event. At lunch, Omari finally spoke to Zania. "That poem, it was real," he said. She looked at him. "Thanks. I didn't know if I should read it." He shrugged. "You did. That's what matters." Then quieter. "I don't think I've ever said that much in school before last week." "You shouldn't have had to," she replied. "But I'm glad you did." The rest of lunch passed with quiet conversation. Not gossip, not rumors, just real talk. Things people had never felt safe enough to say until now. In the faculty room, a different kind of conversation was happening. Ms. Glasper was gathering interest in leading a professional development session on unconscious bias. Mr. Delvecchio had offered to co-lead. Even the teachers who still defended Van Holt were quieter now. Not silenced, but unsure of their footing. And somewhere in the district office, a resignation letter sat waiting to be processed. Ms. Van Holt had chosen to retire early. The board didn't have to vote. The pressure had already done its job. That afternoon, as the buses pulled out and kids filled the sidewalks, someone scribbled something in chalk near the front steps. It wasn't fancy. Just 3 words, crooked but clear. We still matter. But what Pinebrook had learned wasn't just about one teacher. It was about every small moment where someone chooses to speak, and the silence that comes when they don't. Weeks passed, but the impact didn't fade. Zania returned to her routine, but it didn't feel like the same routine anymore. She still read her books, still took quiet notes in class. But something inside her had shifted. She didn't lower her voice when she spoke now. She didn't shrink in her seat. Even when teachers called on her unexpectedly, she met their eyes. And when she walked past the English classroom, now permanently led by a new instructor, she didn't look away. At the first student-led forum, over 50 students showed up. Half of them didn't say a word, but they were there. They sat in folding chairs in the library and listened to their classmates talk about what it feels like to be treated as less, what it feels like to always be corrected, but never really heard, what it feels like to be told your way of speaking isn't the right way, as if language only belonged to one kind of person. Omari stood at the back for most of the session. He didn't plan to speak, but near the end someone asked him why he said something that day. He didn't hesitate. "I didn't say it for applause. I said it because no one else did," he answered, "and because I wanted her to know she wasn't the only one in that room." After that, more forums followed. One a month. Then faculty began attending too. Not all of them were comfortable with it. Some said nothing the entire time. Others asked questions that made students roll their eyes. But they were there. Change didn't happen like fireworks. It happened slowly, quietly, in conversations that weren't easy, in moments when students corrected teachers and didn't get punished for it. It happened when the school adopted a new training on racial sensitivity, but more importantly, when they let students lead parts of it. In one hallway near the 8th grade lockers, a bulletin board went up titled "Words That Matter." Students were allowed to post phrases that made them feel seen or small. A few teachers contributed too. Some of the phrases hurt to read. "She speaks well." "For a black girl, are you sure you belong in honors? You're not like the others." Each phrase was handwritten, raw, real, a reminder of what had been tolerated in silence for too long. Zanaya read each one carefully. Then she pinned up her own card. It simply read, "I don't want to sound ghetto." She didn't put her name on it. She didn't have to. Omari stood beside her when she did. "You think they're listening now?" he asked. "Some of them are," she replied. "That's a start." Later that day, a freshman from another school messaged Omari on social media. Said he'd seen the story online. His cousin went to Pinebrook, and that Omari's words helped him speak up in class too. Said he got sent out for it, but he'd do it again. Omari replied, "Do it again. Every time." That's the part they don't teach in school, the power of your voice, especially when it shakes, especially when it's alone, especially when the room goes silent afterward, but you don't sit back down. Ms. Van Holt never returned. She left quietly, a statement sent by email thanking the district for the opportunity to serve. There were no farewell parties, no staff room cake, just a new beginning in a classroom that would never forget the old one. The district released a vague press statement. But Pinebrook's story didn't need headlines. It lived in the hallways, in the students who now asked more questions, who noticed more, who didn't laugh off remarks that once went unchallenged. In Zanaya's final writing project for the year, she wrote an essay titled, "When Someone Finally Stood Up." It didn't name anyone, but everyone who read it knew exactly who it was about. Her final line was simple. "I used to think being quiet made me safe. Now I know it only makes other people comfortable." Some stories don't end with justice or a big resolution, but they start something. And sometimes, starting something is the most powerful thing you can do. If you believe stories like Zania and Omari's matter, don't stay silent. Share them. Talk about them. And most of all, stand up when it's hardest to. Subscribe for more human stories that challenge, connect, and remind us what courage really looks like.